Welcome to another Vinimark podcast. In this episode, we'll be discussing a topic that has been called the fine wine debate, which has been going on in South Africa for some time. It revolves around trying to decipher the difference between good wine and the ever hallowed fine wine, if such a distinction even exists. So, to help us through the contentious topic, we have the CEO of Areni Global Wine Consulting, Pauline Vicard, to answer some questions about a report that has been causing quite a stir in the world's uppermost wine markets. Now, it's worth noting at the start of this chat that South Africa produces between 6,000 and 8,000 different wines each vintage. Plenty of these wines win international awards from institutions like Concours du Mondial or from the International Wine and Spirits Competition. And even more certain is that many a patriotic South African wine lover would be happy to put their head on a block and claim that South Africa produces some of the best wines in the world. And this is why it might shock these wine lovers to know that while there is no question over whether South Africa produces good wine, there is some doubt over whether we produce any fine wines. And at this point, one might say, oh, please, good wine, fine wine, nice wine. These are all just distinctions without a difference. Just another bit of marketing hocus pocus to try and justify exorbitant prices amongst snooty wine buyers. But global wine consultancy Areni Global have shown that this is simply not the case. And as I've said, they've released a study recently that very clearly shows that the difference between good wine and fine wine is very real in the minds of both consumers and retailers alike. So as I said, I'm going to chat to Pauline Vicard, who's the author of Areni Global's groundbreaking study, which was titled The Future of Fine Wine Consumers. And what we want to do is unpack a little bit about what fine wine actually means, how this definition changes from different markets around the world. But most importantly, we want to try and figure out how South African wines fit into this framework. So, Pauline, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and what an introduction. Wow. I can't wait.
Well, yeah, I'm really excited to unpack all the hard work that you've put into this. Now, this fine wine study, it's the first of its kind. And I know that it took a huge amount of input and resources to produce. So what were some of the driving forces and factors that made this topic, defining fine wine, so important to study right now?
Well, well, thank you. That's a great question to start with. I guess one of the drivers behind that study was simply that we are living in a changing world, and there's what we can see from producers to distributors. It's also a changing rules. Like I come from a winemaker family in Burgundy, and the way my dad saw his job as a winemaker 30 years ago is really different than what my friends of the new generation are seeing their job as winemakers today. And same thing in distributors and intermediaries and what was traditionally called middlemen. They're all rethinking their traditional job and what they had to do. And in order to adapt, because uncertainty and change didn't start with COVID. That's all those changing pieces were already there before. You need a bit of data, and you need a bit of insight, and you need to understand also who the consumer is and how you can adapt best to them, because the wine and fine wine industry has traditionally been very production driven. It was all about the wine, and nobody really cared that much about the consumer. So if we want to adapt a bit, we needed a bit of insight and data. So that was one of the main driving force for that report in particular. Getting some hard and quantitative data and qualitative data as well on who the consumer was, so that we can adapt our strategy all through the supply chain. And then one of the driving force behind Areni itself, so the institute, is also, without being totally dramatic, but there's loads of growing pressure around wine and fine wine. When it comes to legal environment and the legislation around alcohol around the world, when it comes, of course, with environmental pressure, geopolitical pressure. Like I'm not going to teach anyone. It's nothing new for South African. I mean, you've all experienced this quite a lot last year. So there's so much pressure that if we can't, there's no reason to believe that fine wine is going to be protected from new legislation coming ahead on alcohol consumption or big geopolitics debate. So if we can't articulate what fine wine is, if we can't come together behind a definition that makes sense, and we understand the responsibility that comes with that, then there's no reason to believe that we're not going to be that those forces of pressure are not going to go stronger and stronger.
Yeah, and for those who might not be familiar, what are the sort of threats that you see from a legislation perspective? Because I don't know if that's necessarily a sort of common theme here in South Africa. So, what are some of the things that you're picking up, perhaps in a European context, that fine wine would have to be worried about?
Well, it's the European context, but it's also the international context because it's also come from the International Wealth Organization, the World Health Organization, sorry, the WHO. The WHO changed their guidelines from reducing the harmful use of alcohol and the harmful drink of alcohol. So when you drink too much and it's becoming harmful, to just reducing alcohol consumption. And that's a huge difference because it doesn't make any difference between, the different intake of alcohol when you are within friends and drink a nice bottle of wine and it's just 2 glasses per person, or when you're actually drinking too much and it starts to be harmful. So this little change could actually lead to a lot of difference in how different countries then choose to adapt those legislation within the national context. And I was in Scotland last week. There's a lot of things around alcohol that is changing as well. Now you can't take any kids to somewhere that's serves alcohol after 6 p.m. To protect kids from alcohol. Yeah, there's loads of things changing. How the labeling system is changing as well in Europe, and how you'll have to actually now label the calories, the ingredients. That will change also people perception on alcohol, I think. And fine wine won't be extended. You will need to have your ingredient in a bottle of, Chateau Margaux the same way that you've got ingredients in a bottle of £5 bottle of wine.
I mean, I think these legislations and shifts and movements are really important, especially for a South African context, given the history that South Africa has had with alcohol and how it affects the society at large. So
Yes.
to know that there are some legislative changes in some countries abroad that will affect social interactions, that will affect wine consumption. I mean, from both sides of the fence, it's really interesting for us to focus on that and hope to be able to talk
Yeah.
about that more at some stage. But with regards to the study, I mean, I know the point of the study was to try and really define who the fine wine consumer was, right? But it feels like that in some senses this is a bit of a chicken egg situation because you had to do extensive interviews in order to confirm these definitions. And to do that, you must have already had some idea of who you wanted to interview. So, what were your thoughts before you began this topic? Before you started the study, how would you, Pauline, have articulated the difference between good wine and fine wine?
Well, then just going back to the study. So that study about the fine wine consumer is the first that we've done, but we didn't start with that. We started by defining fine wine, or at least trying to define it and put a definition together that we know is going to evolve and change. So we've interviewed like more than 200 members of the trade. We started with the trade first and tried to understand what fine wine was for the trade, and then we extracted from that definition component that we put to the consumer to see if the consumer had the same definition. So it was like kind of those two steps. Then for me, as anyone, I'd say I had my definition of fine wine, which is very, similar to what I look for in the world. For me, fine wine, the difference between fine wine and good wine is fine wine that brings you beauty, respect, and wonder. So there's some sort of beauty that you aesthetic that you might not have. Respect echoes the sustainability part of my own definition of fine wine, the respect for the land, the respect for the people, both the people that do the wine and that drinks the wine, and that kind of wonder. So, when your eyes start to sparkle because you're very excited about that wine, and when you taste it, time stops, and then suddenly everything around you becomes a memory that engraves in your mind because it's that kind of magic sparkle kind of thing. So that would have been my definition of fine wine on a personal level.
Talking about those groups that you had interviewed beforehand, you mentioned you interviewed people in the trade. Can we drill down a little bit into that? What were the sort of positions and roles that you felt were most important to interview?
Well, we tried to be, I mean, the first round of interviews we had, like we interviewed 200 people around the world. So we tried to be balanced in interviewing, journalists, producers, distributors, sommeliers as well. And ask them what's fine wine for you. And we had definition that were from fine wine is a wine that has a value on the secondary market to definition like a fine wine is a wine worth talking about. That's Hugh Johnson's definition. And then we had loads and loads of different there's snippets of who said what, and in the defined fine wine white paper that we republish every other year. So you can find what Madeleine Bouquet said about fine wine, or Justin Howard Sned, who's an MW, or Jane Anson. We've got those definitions somewhere, and so my job was to compile and to get all those definitions together, and see what was a common trends between all of them, like how we could link them all together. The collective definition of Areni of what a fine wine is, and you have to have those four things. So it's not either or, it's all of that together. And to some extent, that's also for me what differentiate good wine with fine wine, because good wine can have, 2 out of 4 or 3 out of 4, but then fine wine will have them all. So the first pillar is about objectivity, like the taste of the wine, a bit like the Blick system that you learn through the WSET, the balance, length, intensity, complexity, um, and the capacity to go through time. So that ageability as well, that's quite important. Then the second pillar of the definition of fine wine is something which is more subjective, as I was saying, the capacity to stop time. So I wasn't the only one thinking that was that it was important for the definition of fine wine, but something that provokes emotions and wonders, which a good wine you might like, but it's not going to stop the time and make you remember everything that goes around you. Then the third one is the relationship with its maker, and the fact that fine wine doesn't happen by mistake. That from the beginning to the end, the winemaker is really willing to do the best that he or she can do, that thrive for excellence, and also its expression of truth, because what the best can mean is also very personal. So it's that definition of their own truth that goes through their winemaking. And the last one, and that's the new one, it's about sustainability and the fact that the fine wine needs to be sustainably produced. So we could talk for hours about what sustainability means, but that was interesting to see that in the trade definition, it came in quite strongly in 2019.
It's quite a high bar to set. Uh,
Yes,
and I suppose that's exactly the idea. But a lot of them I've noticed are often quite subjective. And I know even in your personal definition, you talked about a sense of aesthetic. Um,
yes.
so, I mean, obviously, we're going to talk more about this, but it can open up a whole can of worms about, whether a wine does or doesn't stop time. But I think it's just, for me, those are some of the most powerful things, at least in the mind of the skeptic who says, "Oh, fine wine, good wine, nice wine." When you're talking about a bottle of wine that stops time, that invokes wonder and awe, uh, we've gone beyond the realms of the liquid itself, I think, and maybe that's what's so beautiful about the definitions. That a critic might say this is totally subjective. How can anyone say for certain? And yet, what we're talking about
But
is
because
exactly.
it's only part of the definition, so I can understand, and it's when you try to define art, and I've tried to define art for another for another context, but art is also super difficult to define. But there's always a resonance, which the thing that they've got in common, art and fine wine, is that bridge between the producer and the one that received the art, or the one that drinks the wine, and that kind of emotional connection. But it's not just that. I mean, that's what I'm underlying, that it's those four pillars together. So, for example, one of the things that I always say is, like, a good wine might be good, but it has to be able to age also and to go through time. That relationship with time And a good wine can be totally perfect now. How is it going to be in 10, 12 years is a different question. And there's nothing wrong with not being able to age for 25 years, because there's not that many of us that age wine for 25 years anyway. But that would be a big difference as well.
Yes. Well, I mean, so rather than critiquing those pillars, I think what I was trying to say is that they very effectively communicate that we're talking about a completely different category of drink.
Yes, yeah.
This is not about points on a 100-point scale, or something that somebody likes in a bottle or doesn't like. And I think that's perhaps good wine. The full definition of good wine can be summed up, unfortunately, on some 100-point scale somewhere. But what we're talking about is something that transcends the bottle itself. And I think that's what's really important about the pillars that you just mentioned.
And so just to confirm, this was the definition of the trade, and then when we put it in front of the consumer, it was slightly different. And that's funny that you mentioned critics, because for consumers, the high ratings from critics are very important in their understanding of fine wine. It's not the only one, but it's
Yes.
one of the attributes that's really important for them as well. So that's where you might have a bit of a tension maybe, but yeah,
Yes.
critics and the ratings are still very important for consumers.
Well, let's talk about that consumer group a little bit, because from what
Yeah.
I understand, there were various tiers in your consumer group. Now, how did you decide what those or tiers, or divisions? How did you decide what those divisions were
Well,
going to
we
be?
started. So as you've noticed, our first definition, the one that we've started with from the trade, there's no price point in that, and we don't say a fine wine starts at $50 or £50 or whatever currency. But when you have to do quantitative study, when you have to study the market with interviews and questionnaires more than face-to-face interviews, you've got to define the price, because otherwise people end up comparing pear and apples, and then your data is not really worth it. So we had to tier the price that we wanted to study. And because that study was made in partnership with a negociant on the Place de Bordeaux, Mestreza, that I thank again for being so involved and helping us with that study, um, we actually, used the tier system that they've got in the Place de Bordeaux in terms of price. And when you look at the price, you understand very quickly. So it starts from 30 euros to 400 plus. And you understand very quickly that the consumers that you want to interview that will actually buy on a regular level bottles that are more than 400 euros, or all the very expensive bottles that we hear about, are not going to be your normal consumers. You will have to go and study the high net worth individuals, because of course, the price being what it is, you need to be very wealthy to access those bottles on a regular level. um, so then we've decided on two different methodology. We've studied, through wine intelligence, we had a series of questionnaires in the US, the UK, China, well, mainland China and Hong Kong. And then, because we know that high net worth individuals do not respond to questionnaire, we had a series of interviews and face-to-face interviews to actually see if the high net worth was behaving the same way as a regular, between bracket, fine wine consumer. And that was interesting to compare those two population of drinkers and buyers as well.
So you mentioned a price range from 30 euro up to 400 plus. Did you have sub tiers within that range that you divided your consumers amongst?
People had to buy wines that were over $75 in the US, £50 in the UK, and 500 Hong Kong dollar or RMB in mainland China. And so, if they were not buying over those price points, then the questionnaire would stop, and we wouldn't continue to interview them.
So I mean, and I suppose, and this is the trick, right? That romantics are always wanting to say that quality and price are unrelated. Quality has to be something that can exist without necessarily being expensive.
Well, yeah, yes and no. I think we all agree that quality can exist without the skyrocketing price of like £10,000 a bottle. But I will have a hard time like talking to winemakers that would actually tell you that it's cheap to produce a fine wine, like it's cheap to produce the best that they can do. I mean, there's always more time involved in the vineyard, there's always more details and more attention that is given to winemaking, and everything's really more precise. So that's more resources and more time. I don't think anyone would say it's cheap.
Yeah, and maybe that's why we talked about the relationship to the winemaker and intentionality. That was one of your pillars, and I think that possibly speaks more clearly to the division that you're wanting to make, in the sense that in South Africa, labor is rightly or wrongly relatively cheap. And I think this is
Yes.
one of South Africa's big strengths, is that we can pay the level of attention that some of the finest wines in the world pay at what is objectively a far lower cost. But whether you're working with very expensive rates in the United States, or working with far more affordable labor in South Africa, that intentionality has to still be there for
Yes.
what you've defined as a fine wine, and that it doesn't happen by accident. I want to ask something about barrel selection, because in South Africa, barrel selection is something that is often used to distinguish a top level wine from perhaps a main range wine. And so a lot of estates will harvest, bring in the wine, ferment it all, put them into barrels, and then just before bottling will select the very best barrels, as if to say, these barrels are the best of what nature gave us this year. And for this reason, we're going to charge more for those barrels. But some winemakers have critiqued that idea, saying, well, all you're doing is, it's almost by chance. You're just picking the best ones and charging more, rather than, as your pillar of intentionality seems to imply, starting from the very beginning, have
Yes.
decided to make a fine wine. So, can you talk to that point a little bit?
I would agree with the winemakers that critiques this. I think, and again, I've got nothing against barrel selection, and it's a good way of, having a premium wine in your range, and showcasing people again the best that the year could give. But to me, it's a bit different from really wanting to create fine wine. Also, there's a really interesting notion in fine wine, and that's for both the trade and the consumer. It's time, so the time that it takes to make, but also the consistency, so the quality through time. So you don't, fine wine doesn't happen by mistake or accident, which means that you are able to repeat that highest level of quality, and that expression of truth, of authenticity is a bit of a word that we hear all the time, but that expression of truth of what you think is the best that you can do. And when you talk to fine wine producers around the world, like, they spend hours questioning the viticultural practice, the winemaking practice, again, the attention to details, the attentions to the vine themselves, the attention to winemaking. It's just those little details. Everything from the beginning is thought after, and it's a bit more than just oh, look, those are the best barrel, let's put them together and have the best.
I'd love to try and get you to talk to the tension between the way that that term is used in two different contexts. And here we're talking about an expression of truth in the context of fine wine, and in perhaps in artisanal wine or natural winemaking, they talk about an expression of truth where you're not obscuring the fruit of the vine with things like new oak or crazy yeast strain that boosts thiols. So when you're talking about an expression of truth in fine wine, can you drill down a little deeper and explain how that's different to someone who perhaps only uses old oak and native fermentation because they're trying to express truth of a grapevine?
Well, I think that can be linked. I mean, you can have natural wine producers. I'm not a fan of that expression, but people that work with indigenous yeast and no oak and stuff, and produce fine wine, if they've got the capacity to age. Again, that's a bit. If you take my full pillar, it will still need to be there, the capacity to age and to go through time. And there's loads of new wave natural wine that are super interesting, but I wonder how they will evolve through time. So that's a different question. Why we chose to have that expression of truth and not the expression of terroir. People always forget the human role in terroir. So terroir for me is climate, soil, and people, the human that makes the wine, but also the market, because we forget that the market has been driving winemaking too, in some extent. And so the expression of truth is that kind of human interaction, how the winemaker interprets that terroir, how what does he do or what does she do with a music instrument and a music sheet? How do they reinterpret that music to create what to them? How do they reinterpret that recipe to create what's to them the best that they can do with that recipe or that music instrument?
We often in the wine industry throw around terms like honesty and truth. And I think that it has, ironically, a lot of different definitions in different settings.
Yes, and that's, I mean, and again, that can mean different things, and that expression of truth can lead to very different styles of wine and different, approach to wine. Just like there's not one artist or one interpretation of art, there won't be, similar interpretation of truth when it comes to winemaking. That can be someone that has a very natural wine, like new. I'm going to say new wave because there's been loads of producers that have been producing wines with indigenous yeast and work on fruit purity for years. But that new generation, that can be this, but that can also be someone that thinks that you need a bit more control in some aspect of the winemaking, because that's how you're going to get their best expression of what they want to do, or will allow the wine to evolve through time, or will bring more complexity. Because again, if you take the first pillar, which is the objective characteristic, it's a bit Blake, so balance, length, intensity, and complexity.
I mean, perhaps we can we talk about that, the traveling through time combined with balance, length, intensity, and complexity, because that's another argument that I can't get winemakers to ever agree upon, which is about which is that wines that are built to age, do they need to be drinkable
Yes.
within the first year or two? And this is something I can't get people to agree on. So, what are your thoughts on when you talk about a wine that has an ability to age? Can it be a fine wine in its youth?
Yes, I think so. I think it's different. We had a conversation with Richard Benfield, that asked me, well, then what about the great whites of the world? The wine from Greece, or the Fianos in Italy, and aren't they fine wines? And I'm like, well, it's not because they are drunken young that they can't age. I mean,
Yes.
sometimes people enjoy drinking them young, but it doesn't mean that if they had laid down those bottles, those wines won't have had the capacity to evolve through time. So it's a bit different. And I guess to your point, again, coming from Burgundy, we had all those sorts of wines when I was growing up, where the winemaker will tell you, well, the wine's a bit austere now, but wait for 10 years and it would be amazing.
Mm.
And I mean, again, that's also when wine is a cultural product. I'm not saying that those wines were not fine at the time, or that a wine which is drinkable young is not fine today. It's just you also have to adapt. People not are not waiting for 15 years anymore to drink those wines. Very little. So I think there's nothing wrong in adapting your winemaking a bit so that the wine shows well today, but also has the capacity to go through time and show differently in a decade or so.
We've reached the end of part one of our two-episode discussion with Pauline Vicard from Areni Global Research and Action Institute for the Future of Fine Wine. Now, we've been trying to unpack the differences between good wine and fine wine, as outlined by the groundbreaking report titled The Future of Fine Wine Consumers. Now, in this episode, we touched on elements that wine professionals felt were essential in any bottle of fine wine. But in the next episode, we're going to dig deeper into what fine wine consumers around the world are looking for in a bottle of fine wine. We'll also touch on how South Africa's best wines fit into this world of fine wine.